Hi everyone, my name is James. I'm the VP of Engineering at Griffin, and I've had the honor and the privilege of doing that role since March of 2021. And what that role means at Griffin is two main things. So it's responsibility over people and process within engineering. So the people part is all about growing the team by finding amazing developers and recruiting them, but also growing them once they've joined the team through one-to-ones and coaching and feedback. So growth is a big part of what I do. And then the process part, that's all about how we work together with the product team. There's a really tight connection at Griffin between product and engineering, but also the rest of the business. And that's about making sure that we're building the right thing and building it the right way. There's sort of two halves to that equation. And at Griffin, that's all about, it's about the thoughtfulness that we put into making those decisions. It's a way of deliberating and designing and collectively and collaboratively working together to come up with the best ideas. And it's a lot about thinking about the long term over the short term. I think a lot of organizations and a lot of people get a bit stuck thinking about the short term. And of course, sometimes you need to be pragmatic and do that. But oftentimes, just putting that little bit of extra thought in before to get to a better choice and not paint yourself into a corner, it is the right thing. So that's a big part of our culture and how we work. And then personally, I live in Stockholm in Sweden. I have a wonderful family and a cat who may jump in front of the camera if she's around. And I'm a bit of a nerd about decision making. I love the topic, so I'm feeling really excited to dive into it with you today. Thanks for having me, Matt.
Yeah, I'm so happy you're part of this. You get like bonus points for describing how your role is focused on engineering, and then you immediately start with people and process. A lot of the Culturevist community are focused on people and work really closely with engineering teams. So this is a cool intersection. The people experience in a company will be really dependent on the company and the context and the culture. So could you share a bit about Griffin? Tell us about the company.
We're a banking as a service platform, and we relatively recently got a UK banking license, which was a big thing for us. And what that means is we're a platform for fintechs to build their financial products on top of. And the differentiator is the speed that they can do that, the ease that they can do that because of the simplicity and the clarity of our product, and then the price. It's cost effective for them. So that's how we differentiate ourselves as a business. And then in terms of the company and the culture and what attracted me to Griffin in the first place and makes it so wonderful to work there still, it is the culture. And that is really important to me. And I know it's important to the founders and David and Alan, who are the two co-founders. They care a lot about that, and it sort of seeps through in everything at Griffin. And I think culture really comes from the top down, and it's about how you structure things. Like we were saying when we were talking just before this started, it's about incentives, it's about decision making, and it's about trust. And it's about hiring people who you trust and then trusting them. And there's so much of that at Griffin, and it makes it really special. We're remote first. That's probably worth pointing out. So that changes slightly how we work. So there is a HQ and an office in London, but we have local hubs all over the UK and even all across Europe. So as I said, I'm based in Stockholm. We also have a hub in Germany and then one in Ireland. So you can meet with your local hub of people. We also get together about every 6 months with everybody. So even though it's remote first and we're tuned for that and we try and be asynchronous and we try and create space for deep work and all of those good things that are important with that, we do also see the importance of actually connecting with each other and meeting up for real. And we're Series A and we're about 70 people, just so people get an understanding of the size.
That's really helpful. Thank you. So I consider culture as a force, and it's the combination of the different influences within a company and that flow from it. So one of the biggest influences in a company is how are decisions made and what's prioritized when decisions are made. So when I saw that you've been looking at this at Griffin, I was immediately like, yes, let's go deep on that. So could we start with, why did you think, okay, we need to iterate on how we make decisions at Griffin? Was there a problem that needed to be solved? Like, why did you look at this?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there was a problem, maybe even three problems. So let's think about them. So I think there was a problem of efficiency of decision making. I think there was a problem of quality, a little bit. I'll dive into that. And I definitely think there was a problem of scale. So the scale problem is more a sort of future, long-term problem, maybe not at the time that we made this change, but I could see that becoming a bigger and bigger problem. So let's talk about those one by one. So starting with efficiency. So originally, at least within engineering, it was essentially Alan, who's the CTO, and myself. We became the bottleneck for decisions because engineers weren't feeling comfortable making decisions by themselves, especially if they thought they're important. So they tended to get routed through us. And that meant that we had to then dive into it. We had to understand it. And obviously, we have quite full calendars, so that could delay it in terms of efficiency. And we would, of course, try and get people's ideas, but there wasn't really a process for that. And then we would make a decision. I think that's a pretty standard way of making decisions in this sort of hierarchical structure. Um, but yeah, I just felt like we could speed that up. And then the second part was quality. So Alan, he's an exceptional decision maker. He's one of the best I've ever worked with. Not only because he thinks so deeply about things, but he's able to change his mind as soon as you give him evidence that's like, oh yeah, I hadn't thought about it that way. And I spend a lot. Like I said, I'm a nerd about decision making, so I spend a lot of time trying to understand it, trying to understand cognitive biases. So I think we're both pretty good decision makers, but even so, we've hired these brilliant engineers. You know, they have experience, they have intelligence, they have background, they have ideas and innovation. So the question is, why wouldn't we want to harness that even more strongly? Why wouldn't we want to take an opportunity there? So that's the quality bit. I don't think it was bad, but it's more like going from good to great, if that makes sense, Matt. And then the last bit is about scale. I just think fundamentally centralized decision making just doesn't scale because as the system grows, if you like, you almost inevitably have to put in more layers of structure for it to work. And then there's, you know, almost information chains going up and down where decisions are actually getting made. But it tends to be that they get pushed further and further away from where the actual knowledge and expertise and insights are. And that struck me as a worrying thing for the future. So I think it was that combination of those three problems combined that really drove us to how can we do this a bit better? Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And it's great awareness, self awareness, and organizational awareness that you realized. So could you take us through what does it look like now? What's this current version? How does decision making happen?
Yeah. So this might scare people a bit because it's 6 steps. I wrote a blog post about this so people can look it up so they don't need to take notes. But I just want people to give it a chance because it sounds overly complicated in a way that there's that many steps. But I think each step has a reason for being there, and I'll try and explain that as we go through. So step one is all about identifying the problem that you're trying to solve. And the important part there for us is that the problem needs to be of a certain type. It needs to have a certain amount of complexity or irreversibility, or I guess even criticality. Like it's some combination of those three. And the more of those three it is, the more important the decision is, obviously. And why then? Why is that important that you kind of identify the right problems to solve with this decision process? It's because there's a cost, right? A democratic process involves people, which involves time and it involves energy. And you can choose groups of different size, so you can kind of select how much cost a decision has, but there's still a cost involved. So we think that's really important. We don't want people to be doing this for every single little choice that they make, right? That makes no sense. We're slow to accrual. So it's about together learning what are the right problems to solve in this way. So that's really important for step one. And then whoever's identified this challenge or this problem, we sort of put it on them to describe it, to write down the problem, and then share that with the group that they think is a reasonable size for solving that. So it's often that they share that either with their team, if the impact of the challenge is a team-wide challenge, or it could be with the whole of engineering. But obviously that's a broader scope. And why is writing it down so important? That's one of the key insights I think I've really started to understand at kind of a core level since being at Griffin more, is the value of writing for thinking clearly. Because it's not until you've written something down that you can truly say that you understand it. because something can feel like you understand it in your brain, right? But then when you try and explain it to somebody, it doesn't come out quite the way that you're hoping. But if you've written it down, you've had to pick the right words, you've had to pick the order, and there's such a huge value in that. And there's this quote that I like, that a perfect formulation of a problem is already half of its solution. So there's a lot of that thinking here, that if we can really crisply describe the problem, we're off to a great start. We can align on the problem, which means then we can align on the solution. And step 3, that is the solution bit. So that's getting everybody together and collaboratively, but we do it asynchronously because we're remote first, coming up with brainstorming ideas for how do we solve that problem. So we use Notion for this, but any kind of collaborative tool, Google Docs or whatever would work. And the idea is that you all just kind of dive in and you're bouncing ideas off each other and you're coming up with different ways of solving it. And the thinking there is, if you just have one option, you don't have any option. If you've got 2 options, you've got yourself a dilemma. And 3 or more options, now you're talking. Now you're giving yourself a chance to actually be innovative and to come up with the right solution. So we try and spend some time on this and not just go for the easy, quick, obvious one, but actually think it through together, if that makes sense. And then the next step is really important, and it sounds kind of boring and nerdy, but let me try and sell you on it. So the next step is creating what's called a decision matrix. So a decision matrix, if you've not seen one before, it's like a spreadsheet. And the basic idea is that you list the different criteria that you're interested in discussing for the problem and solution space. And then you list the different solutions as columns. And then you basically just, you can imagine it, right? You compare them against each other. So if I give you a really basic example of that, let's say we're deciding which restaurant we want to go to. We might have different criteria around the proximity of the restaurant, the price, what the service is like, what else? What might we care about? The quality of the food, of course. And the most important thing, how good is their creme brulee? Right, that's the obvious and most important factor. And then you'll compare all the restaurants and you'll kind of weigh them up against each other. And the value of doing that is how it gets the whole decision-making process out on the table for everybody. So there's a transparency to it, and it goes back to the writing part, because you're having to use words to describe these different challenges. So you start to get this sort of shared vocabulary about the problem space and about the solution space. And just that is worth its weight in gold. So that's a really important step. The next step is then we do a vote. So we've got these, let's say, 3 options. So we do an anonymous asynchronous vote. We use Slack. And why we do an anonymous one is to get rid of cognitive biases. So what I mean with that is, before when Al and I were making choices, if it wasn't anonymous, people could see what I'd voted or what Alan has voted, and it might make them second guess. They might really feel it's C, but if we've gone for A, why did we do that? And maybe we're right. And so the anonymous part gets rid of that and makes it hopefully fairer. And there's also a little bit of a psychological aspect there, because if I've publicly committed to a position, it's harder to then sort of walk back from that later. Whereas if I've anonymously committed, if someone comes up with a good argument, it's like, okay, I can go with them more easily. So again, it's like easing the path for doing the right thing. If we reach total consensus, so if everybody picks option B, we're done. And you might have noticed everything's been asynchronous up to this point. So that way we've picked an option, we've done collaborative brainstorming, all of that totally asynchronously. We've not even had a meeting. And engineers like that, right? That's good, because meetings can get you out of your focus zone. So that's awesome. However, if one person goes with C and the rest with A, we're not quite in agreement, and it's probably worth having a meeting. So that's when we book a decision meeting. There's a whole process around that. I talk about it in the blog post. I don't want to dive into it now because we might go on too long. But the basic idea is to get to rough consensus at the end of that meeting. And that's the process, 6 steps.
One of the things people consider is, how do we make sure we get a balance of not having too little process and not having too much process? So I think some people might think, now there's 6 stages, that's a lot to go through. But my sense is that you had a previous way of working. You've kind of thought from first principles, okay, what's the minimum that's required for us to have effective decision making? Mm-hmm. This is what that looks like. That our product, if the product is the decision making process, that product has these 6 steps. That's what you're now testing, I guess, and then you'll find out, okay, is this working for us, us, or do we need to change the steps in that process, or the number of steps and so on?
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great way of looking at it. This isn't a Bible, right? This is the one true way of doing this. This is up to now, this is the best way we've discovered. And we're constantly reevaluating and reassessing and saying, can we do this more effectively, more efficiently? And I don't know if you notice, but sometimes you can sort of short circuit it, because if you start with step one and you start identifying the problem and you realize, oh, that's not a big enough problem to need this, you're not doing 6 steps. If you get to step two where you're writing it down and you realize the solution already, you're not doing it. So it's not like it's always 6 steps. It's just as you start going down, it's more and more obvious that you should be taking more time, because it's sort of past those different milestones, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's like a funnel as well, a decision-making
Yeah.
funnel where they get like fed out of it until you really need the meeting, for example. The second thing that comes to mind is some people have a certain feeling about consensus, and is that a great idea, or there's a cost to that? Is it even possible? Given if you want diversity of perspective, then actually trying to get consensus might actually kind of work against that. So is it sounds like there's a point that you get to, there will be one person, is it, who does make a final decision if a decision has not been met by consensus?
That's right. Yeah. So it's consensus, I guess you could say, up until it isn't. But I talked about rough consensus being the goal of the decision meeting. If I can quickly define what I mean by that, it comes from the IETF. I think we stole it from. You know what they say: good artists borrow, great artists steal. But the basic idea is that rough consensus is when you've gotten rid of the fundamental flaws in any of the solution propositions. So if someone was worried, oh, A isn't going to work because of X, Y, and Z, but someone else says, oh, it will because you're forgetting about A and B, and you have that discussion, and as long as no one's saying, well, A cannot work because of this, as long as that discussion has sort of gone out of the way, then we know that A can work. So it's now an option. And let's say out of 3 options, we get down to 2 where we get rid of all the fundamental flaws, and 1 flaws are still remaining. So we can't do C. We've agreed on that. Then we've got 2. We try and get people to agree, but if there's still a difference, it's probably just a difference of opinion, and they're both going to be okay. And what we normally try and do is whoever's driving that meeting, it's randomly selected, so it's not just me or Alan, again, to avoid biases, and so people can learn how to do that. Whoever's driving says, let's do B, and we disagree and commit. That's one of our values at Griffin, that we need to be effective, right? Like, so consensus is good for collaboration, for innovation, but it reaches a point where we can't just be stuck in analysis paralysis. We have to move forward, and that's the point. So we've booked a decision meeting. At the end of that meeting, we are going to have a decision, and we're going to disagree and commit on that. And it could be that we say, let's do B as an experiment. And if it starts to be that any of the things that people wanted A were worried about come into fruition, okay, we can reassess. We're not stuck with it forever normally. Sometimes there are decisions when it's such a commitment that you do get kind of stuck with it. But do you understand what I mean? That it is consensus up to the rough consensus point, and then somebody just picks, and then we go and we agree.
That does make sense. This has been brilliant to get an insight. Thank you so much for sharing the why you did it and what it looks like in practice. If somebody's following along and they think, oh, we could improve decision making in our team or company, what advice would you offer them?
Yeah, that can be a challenge, because if they're thinking that, they're probably thinking that a change needs to be made. And in my experience, organizational change it can be a difficult thing, especially depending on the culture in your organization. And change can just be difficult fundamentally because change involves the unknown, and the unknown is scary for humans, right? So I think a big part of that, if you're wanting to make changes, you need to get people feeling comfortable and confident. And the way I like to do that, there's this book I read called Switch, by Chip and Dan Heath, and they talk about this metaphor about the elephant and the rider, where the elephant represents somebody's emotions and the rider represents their more sort of rational thinking part of their brain, where you can imagine the elephant just going off and the rider's like, no, don't do that, but you know, if you're having a bad day. So we've all experienced that, I'm sure. So the idea is, how do you sell someone in a way that connects with the why, that's sort of an emotional why, and an intellectual why. So coming back to this decision making, I think, let's say it's an engineering department. Okay, I don't think it's going to be difficult to sell it to the engineers, because what you're saying is you now get to take part more. There's more autonomy. You get to, that's going to be an easy sell. It's going to be a harder sell to the CTO or the people that currently have the decision making power, right? Because they might feel like they're giving up something. So I think then the important way to tell the story or sell it in is to sell it into their elephant with a kind of story about, yeah, how would I do that? Maybe talking about their legacy, maybe talking about empowering the people in their team, and the things that feel good. And then the 3 points I made before about why we did it. Those are a good way to appeal to the rider. So talking about the scale part, the efficiency, the quality. So some combination of that story, I think, could maybe be enough to get people over the line and understanding why this is so important. But just convincing people is only half the battle, because the other half is actually putting it into practice, right, and making it stick. So there, what that book talks about, which I think is really important to understand, is about the path. So that's about slicing things out of the way, and it's about reducing friction for doing the right thing, and then potentially increasing friction or putting guardrails for doing the wrong thing. And I think that just helps people. We're busy. We have lots of things on our mind. We're deciding about this and that. We have our work. We have our life. So anything that we can do that kind of shapes the path forward for people, I think, can really help. So those 6 steps, that's a lot about that, right? It's about getting a process in place that really guides people to hopefully making slightly better choices each time.
This has been such a great insight into how decisions are made and even advice for others. If people would like to understand more about this work, is there a way they can do that?
Sure, they can follow along with the Griffin's adventure on our blog. I think you can subscribe to get updates there. So it's griffin.com, I think, /blog, or there'll be a link at the top under resources. And if they're interested in me, I'm not on social media, except I'm on LinkedIn, but I don't post there that often. But if I post new blog posts, I do tend to link them in LinkedIn. So it's James Trunk and Griffin, and they'll find me.